talk to people at Cornell, and I mean, I was director of the Center for Latin American Studies at Rutgers too, and I know how important these things are. And usually, and I don't know if this is the tradition here, but kind of the environmental issues in Latin American studies get not a lot of highlight. They're more like, political and cultural, which is same, I see that. So I felt like, sometimes I think that that's important, so I would like to do that. So why not to reach out? And so thanks for the invitation. I want to thank Bill and Ken and Amanda for also helping bringing me here. So what I would like to do today is talk about my work, and I'm going to try to sort of like explain a little bit sort of where I come from, what kind of geographer I am, and as a geographer, what kind of work I do. And then just give you sort of examples of these three main projects that I've been working on, the ones that Ken talked to you about it, the one in the Yucatan, in Ecuador, and the most recent work that we've been able to publish from Colombia. So I wanted to start with this slide, as I usually put it there. And so this is in the forest of the Yucatan. This is the southern part of the peninsula. This is like usually a rainforest. And what you see there is the effect that a hurricane had on the canopy of that forest. So what you can see is like it really took away all that sort of green stuff on the top. And so a lot of what we see in terms of landscapes and trying to understand landscapes is the effect that some of these sort of disturbances have on the way that they are configured. And I think this is one of the things that I've been interested in looking at. So as a geographer, I've been interested in the field of land change. And so I want to just sort of explain to you what that is, because I feel like it's sort of something that is more recent as a discipline, but that we're trying to sort of like work on and sort of provide some sort of like framework in trying to understand landscape studies. So we think about land change. Probably you're familiar with the words land use and land cover change. Maybe there's some words that you see here and there. But in terms of understanding sort of the patterns and the drivers of those change, can we formalize that into sort of more of a science? And so what I've been working in the last 15 years is in that field, and in trying to sort of come up with sort of ideas of how can we look in terms of, maybe through synthesis of case studies, or through some sort of theories that can be social or ecological or both, in understanding how those landscape dynamics occur. And my focus has been mostly in the tropics. And as you can see in the definitions that I have here, most of the work has been on these major changes that you see in the news, no? Deforestation, desertification, urbanization. But in this field, we're also interested in things that are not that obvious, that are more subtle, like things like regrowth. How that occurs. That's important, but that's less like this dynamic, this very obvious kind of phenomena, at least in terms of the pattern. And so these are also part of the things that in this field we're sort of interested in looking at. So the way that we sort of try to think through is like, okay, can we connect regions? Can things be connected in terms of how deforestation occurs or reforestation occurs? How management practices are connected, how this whole idea of ecosystem services are part of the story as well. And finally, some of the themes that land change as a science sort of tries to cover are around governance or land atmospheric interactions. You can see the stretch of the field. What I'm more interested in is in kinds of the thing that I have in red, which is basically how land change is sort of as a trade-off for ecosystem services and biodiversity. So some of the landscapes that I've been looking at are mostly rural areas in Latin America. So I've been working in the Yucatan Peninsula for around 15 years, in the southern part of the peninsula, where you have mostly shifting cultivation, where the Mayas used to be, where there's a lot of history there, at least human use history. And more recently, I've been working on Ecuador and Colombia. So part of the challenge with land change, in addition to obviously trying to provide a theoretical framework that is very interdisciplinary, is how we are able to engage different scientists across that field as well. So that has been part of the issue. So what we see is that there's a lot of more recent publications regarding how, as a science, we can think about land change. And it's not only in terms of the theory again, but in terms of the methods, what are the challenges around it. And what we have right now is the Global Land Program. I don't know if anybody's, no, probably. So this is basically, if you think about the human dimensions of environmental change programs, that are international programs that are concerned about sustainability, about biodiversity conservation, about sort of the International Geosphere Biosphere Program. So this is a program that is sort of connected to them, the Global Land Program, and is coming from this interest in understanding land use, land cover change. So I'm part of the scientific committee, and we have an open science meeting that comes every other year, and we're trying to deal with this phenomena. So this is where I come from. So this is where I'm trying to sort of like provide like my results and my contributions. So I'll be very happy to talk more about it. And I think many of you might be interested in fields that are a little more interdisciplinary. So I feel like this could be sort of a good venue for you to sort of like reach out to that type of work. So what do I do in our group at Rutgers? So we are looking at, again, pattern and process of land use and land cover change. And we've been looking at forest resilience in terms of what happened to forests after disturbances, hurricanes, droughts, and fires. Land use, we can think about land use to be a disturbance. Some others might just challenge that a little bit. And in order to do that, we're trying to use remotely sensed data, spatial analysis, and try to link a lot our sort of understanding of patterns to socioeconomic data and ecological data. So we're trying to sort of bring those three angles in understanding these patterns and process. Okay, so that's the question. So these are the main projects. I think I have a cold. It's starting a cold, so I'm going to be drinking water as I talk. So these are the main projects that we've been working in the lab. So we are looking at environmental disturbances in Mexico and the Southern Peninsula. We're looking specifically at this hurricane event that I mentioned at the beginning, Hurricane Category 5 in 2007. Then we were looking at how silvopastoral systems actually happen in areas of the Ecuadorian Amazon. And most recently, through this Fulbright, we've been looking with my group, with colleagues at the Universidad Nacional, at how deforestation is actually happening in protected areas after the Peace Treaty, as the signing of the Peace Treaty in Colombia. So I'm going to try to talk about all of those, but I will go very quickly. So if you have any questions, I will be delighted to talk about each of those in an extensive form. So, but I will try just to give you a sense of more or less where the contributions have been for those three projects. So, why my interest in tropical forests, and mostly on these patterns that are not that like the deforestation, but more into like the regrowth. So this is a paper that was published in 2011. It's a little old, and it's just showing how are the sort of like the trade-offs in terms of carbon storage or uptake and release, at the contribution by different kinds of forest types. And so what you see here is in purple and green is sort of like the uptake, you can think, of carbon by primary forest and secondary growth. What we see is that tropical regrowth have a very critical piece on that carbon budget. So part of my interest in looking at regrowth has to do with what we see that is more, we're going to see more regrowth occurring, and this is going to be important in terms of carbon emissions and carbon budgets. So this is old, but I can refer you to recent papers that are looking at regrowth in Latin America, where they show how critical the regrowth is going to be in terms of that carbon offset. Okay, so we need to sort of study how those come about and sort of understand the dynamics of those places. So in terms of resilience, what we think about is, okay, how these forests after agriculture or pasture can come back. So this is another paper in Nature that shows how, by using plot data, these are the different circles, you can think about how long it takes for a forest after being cut to come back to what it was originally there, or mature forest. This is in terms of biomass, not in terms of diversity. So what we see here is that after probably around 20 years, you could come back more or less to have the same amount of biomass that you had originally in some of these areas. So all the work is based on a model that is spatial, but based on this plot level data from sort of forests across Latin America. So we think that the secondary forests are playing an important role, that they are important in terms of, not only in terms of the ability to come back, but also the ability of maintaining biodiversity and ecosystem services such as carbon, which I mentioned before. So when I'm thinking about resilience, and I think about resilience in my systems, I'm thinking about, okay, how these forests are coming back, in which ways are they coming back, and are they performing the same functions that they were before? So that's one piece. So that will be sort of like the ecological resilience. But then, and I think most of you probably are interested in, okay, how we think about the social resilience. Can we think about those systems in terms of socio-ecological resilience and not in this binary form? And I think this is what we're trying to do, at least in the Mexican case, in trying to sort of think through more from both perspectives. So this is where we do our work. It's the Mesoamerican Biological Corridor in the Yucatan. These are the two biosphere reserves, Xiancan and Calakmul. So what you see here, these little polygons, these are ejidos. These are commonly owned, managed land. So it's different from private land. So they basically make decisions about what to cultivate, what to do in terms of forest conservation as a group. And so this is like each of those communities will decide more or less their land management for that polygon. As you can see, it's very much embedded into that region. So what you see is basically a place where you have people that are doing agriculture, very different from what you will think of the Yucatan Peninsula, where maybe you are more familiar with Cancun, or with the sort of like the touristic areas. And so here what we have is semi-subsistence farmers that are just growing milpas, which is corn, and they do it in terms of shifting cultivation. So they take a plot, they clear it, they cultivate, they move it to the next. And more or less that's what you see in the land. The forest is this deciduous forest, but it's mostly tropical. As you see, it's green. And one of the most interesting things in that place is that obviously this was the home of the Maya civilization. And so at some point, these were areas that were completely used and deforested. And what we see is this picture that is taken recently, where the forest actually has been able to come back. The forest that you see there, the species, the composition, reflects in a way that use that was done by the Mayas. So what is interesting about this region is that you have this conflict between conservation and just regular use, like people trying to have a living. So that makes it sort of an interesting place to understand landscape dynamics. And the fact that I do shifting cultivation, it means that these patterns of deforestation that you probably will see like in the Amazon, which is more like a frontier, you just go cut and you cut large extents, these things don't occur here. What you see is a much more dynamic kind of cycle where you will see clearance, and then all of a sudden in a few years you will see that land coming back again, which makes it a really, really interesting place to study. So we've been working on disturbances. So it's been, the peninsula in the Caribbean has been affected by hurricanes. It's something that happens frequently. Obviously there's logging, because this is, again, a forest with mahoganies and cedars. So it has importance in terms of forestry as well. And because they do shifting cultivation, fires is also part of of the sort of the disturbance that you have there. So with hurricanes in 2007, we had a Category 5 hurricane that went exactly through that corridor. So if you see this here, this is the path of that hurricane, Dean, in 2007. So I was working in the region before looking at invasive species, and this was a great opportunity to understand, to study the effect that this particular disturbance had on the forest and also on land use. So the way that we've been thinking about resilience, again, was this dichotomy, this binary way. You know, can we think about ecological resilience in terms of, okay, the hurricane comes, blows out the leaves, how long it takes to come back, maybe in biomass and species to what it was before. But when we think about social resilience, it gets a little more complicated. And so this is the definition I'm going to be using for the talk, and that I've been using in what we work. And it's sort of the system, the land system as a system, not as the ecological and the social, but something that is much more sort of together. And how they respond to disturbances would affect, obviously, the system, and how they reorganize and they maybe perform similar functions as they did before. So when we think about social resilience, obviously you cannot think about maybe shifting cultivation as a very solid system that has to go back to a particular situation. But what we can think of is like, okay, so if you have a hurricane and your house is being destroyed, and the state has the means to provide you with ways to sort of like rebuild, in which way you will rebuild. And so this is an example of the way that the state thought that will be important to rebuild, which is these little houses that are like prefabricated houses. Now, you smile because it's like, that is nothing similar to this in terms of, I mean, they will say, okay, we are providing some sort of, there's some sort of support to overcome the event, that your house was damaged. But that building, that specific structure, is not going to be used for them as a house. It's like the storage place. But when you think about, again, the system as socially resilient, it's like, okay, but the house was built. So that's what I'm trying to say, is like it's a little more complicated when you try to think about what social resilience is. Because basically, do you want to go and have the system as it was before? It was before like this, how this community lived, or was it just like the fact that you have a structure? So it's very different than forest. So that's what the challenge is. So what we've been able to do is, again, we're trying to look at this event, especially the hurricanes, and this is the one that I'm going to be talking about. And this is what we've been able to publish. So I'm just going to show, I'm not going to go over all these articles, but basically what we tried to look at, we have this event. Can we start talking about what happens to so like the structure of the forest, the trees, the actual trees? What happens in terms of diversity? What happens in terms of the region? So like, can we map that event? And so we sort of try to look at this in that way, so from really regional all the way to the plot. And part of the work that we want to do too is have to do with, okay, how droughts and other kinds of disturbances are also affecting the system. So what I'm going to just show you kind of quickly, sort of like the main findings, and just in a nutshell, what we found is that secondary forests are usually much more resistant to these kinds of disturbances. So they tend, so common species will be the ones that will dominate after this event. Rare species are the ones that are affected the most. And in terms of composition, structure, bigger trees will be the ones that are obviously affected the most, and they will be usually connected to the rare species. So what it implies is that these disturbances are going to push the forest to be more secondary as opposed to the old growth. And I think that for us was an important finding, because usually what you see is that maybe some of these forests are sort of adapted to these kinds of storms, and they might be part of their, like as a primary forest, you have that disturbance and you can sort of recover, but that is not what we sort of found in our studies. So this is part of the map that we developed of the storm just right after it occurred. So, and again, I usually say this when I present this work, is like, if you imagine a Category 5 hurricane going through a forest, this forested area, these are like winds of 180 miles per hour. It's pretty high. Do you imagine the red here is the areas that were affected the most by the wind damage? And it will be like a red blob. It should be all of it. Why is this pattern? Why do you have certain areas that seem to have more and others not? And here is where the configuration of the landscape is going to matter. Obviously, you're going to have more damage where you have forest. That's important. But also, how the configuration of that forest is. And I think this is what we were trying to sort of study and work our way out. So I'm going to just show some of these results looking at fragmentation and the damage at different levels. So my grad student did some very interesting work looking at different kinds of buffers around plots that we did on the ground and looking at the damage, and sort of like making these buffers bigger and bigger and looking at fragmentation and seeing how the damage relate to it. And so what we found is that you can find a very interesting signal in terms of how fragmentation and damage relate when you do regional, but as you go much more detailed, then that doesn't hold as much. So what it means is that basically, maybe we're not looking at the similar scale sometimes when we compare fragmentation and disturbance. And that's a big question in ecology, how fragmentation and disturbances relate. And so this is sort of like part of the things that we sort of found. And what we try to do is relate the fragmentation to land use. So when we think of more fragmented landscape, that will be in a place where people do more agriculture. If you do more forestry, probably you have a less fragmented place. So what we're trying to say is like, okay, if you practice agriculture, you have a hurricane, probably you're going to be affected, dramatically. But if you have a forest, maybe less. But then the question is, if you have forest, you live, forest is part of your life. So that forest that is damaged is going to affect me more, even if the damage is not as large as I will find in forestry hedos. But what we found is basically, this relationship between forestry and agriculture. And so part of our recommendations is like, can we think that when these disturbances occur, that maybe it's less in forest, but that because the livelihoods depend on forest, they have to be sort of taken seriously as well. So we did a lot of local work, like plot level data work. So like trying to sort of like have 100 by 5 meters, and we measure every single tree and what kind of damage it is the most challenging field work. And I don't know how many of you have experience doing field work. I mean, a lot of you. So, but just going through a forest that is cut in half and just trying to do a straight line and measure it was insane. And so what we've been trying to do is obviously we did all that work. So we have all the trees tagged. And so we've been following up so we can actually see sort of the lag effects of the storm. Because usually when you think about damage, you just think about the moment of the storm, but the lagging effects are going to be important. So that's what we're trying to sort of do. So this is some of the results on the species. Again, the less common species, they have less damage than, the more common species have less damage than the rare species. So again, that's the result that I talked to you about at the beginning. So it's this idea of secondarization of the forest in a way because of this storm. So I thought that was sort of an important contribution. And this is just the results in terms of structural damage. And again, it's sort of the same story, how secondary forests are affected less than primary. And this is basically our plots, 90 plots. And these are the proportion of stems that had different kinds of damage, none to dead. And each plot is sort of, this is basal area, this is the number of stems. And then you assume that if the damage is sort of distributed evenly through the line, it's evenly affected. But if you have over the line or below the line, you'll have bigger trees affected more and smaller trees affected less. So that's what those show. But the end of the conclusion has to do with this. And finally, I think this is important. So the issue with how people were affected by these storms. And so we did 300 interviews on these communities that we did all the plow work. And what we found is that even though the storm was something that it was really, obviously affected them, there was a lot of immediate response after the storm in terms of structural damage, they were not necessarily too concerned about the future effects of that storm. They were concerned about other disturbances that were occurring for them. And one of the things that they keep mentioning was droughts. So what we found through an interview, even though our focus was on hurricanes, is like, okay, so what happened with the hurricane? Are you going to change the way you do milpas? Are you going to do this, that, adaptation? All these interesting questions that we do ask when something like this occurred. They're like, yeah, but what are you insisting on the storm? The droughts is what is like something. And with droughts, what you have is the issue of uncertainty. They do shifting cultivation, which means they burn their plots at a particular time of the year when rains are going to come. If they are not coming at the time they're expecting, that's a problem. So dealing with that uncertainty has been an issue. And so that's where we try to sort of work more, and that we're able to publish some of those kinds of ways that they're sort of thinking in terms of how to cope with that disturbance. So they look at changing in terms of when they plant. Maybe changing the types of maize they will be able to plant if they have these shifts and when they can do shifting cultivation, ways of storing water. So I think that was sort of like an interesting outcome. So sometimes we get focused on some particular event, and then there is something else that is actually that matters the most to them. So I guess one of the things that I find that is important from this work is sort of like to be able to do research on areas where people is actually doing the work. So I know maybe I'm not talking to mostly ecology crowd, but we tend to really focus when we think about forests and disturbances on primary forests or forests that people are not necessarily doing much. And I think that is important to actually do some research on the ground and obviously regional on those places where people are continuously using it, and especially when you have these kinds of interesting dynamics. And the other thing is like this, you see these dots there, these are the plots that we've been working. This is the areas that we sort of tagged, 28 of those. We need to have these long-term studies of these places, but it's a challenge. So it's good to have those plots and keep measuring and going back to them to understand sort of the lag effects. But these places are not the places that people are going to say for you. They're going to say, oh, I need to do my work. Sorry, you have your plot. We're moving on. We're going to cultivate. And it's like, okay, that should be part of the data that we have and the things that we need to sort of study and understand. And I know that that's not good statistically. It's actually terrible statistically. But I don't see really another way to do it. So having these long-term studies and working in these sites, I think is just a really important thing to do. And so this is sort of like the way that we're starting to think that the system, we're trying to just sort of like combine more the different pieces, but is how can we look at fragmentation and the services around land use in this more sort of, and this is what land change science does a lot. Love the boxes with arrows going back and forth. It's really important. And then feedbacks, and it's just, we're really good at that. Okay, so this is so I'm going to shift to the Pastoral Landscapes research, and I'm going to just focus on one particular paper that we just got published. So the interesting thing about this system, so this is pastures that have trees that are near the Amazon in Ecuador. This is not your typical large-scale Amazon. It's more like the Piedmont. So it's like the transition between like the Andes and the Amazon. And this being a place where cattle has been done for quite a long time. So this is not something recent. It's not your typical cattle frontier of the Amazon. No, that you have, maybe farmers start just cutting land, and then all of a sudden these big projects come in, and then cattle comes, and then it's like really large pieces of land. This has happened in Brazil. Here what you see is that historically they have been doing that. And so what we see is a landscape that looks more like a combination of these pastures with trees, not your large-scale pastures. And what we saw, or at least my colleague Tom Rudell, saw is that these kinds of landscapes were sort of developing more of a kind of a spontaneous way. So it's not agroforestry in the managed sense of the term. So it's not like, oh, I have a program that wants to do agroforestry. How can we have pastures and trees and be sustainable? But it's something that is more, okay, this is a place where we're close to a really cool forest. So we have a lot of seeds that come in anyway. And we want to do cattle, and then we're not going to cut all the trees. And so we wanted to ask, okay, why is this happening? So that was part of the question, and how that translated into ecosystem services. So to me, my personal question was, how can we think of the contributions in terms of carbon storage of those silvopastoral systems? So that's what I'm going to talk about very quickly, and I could talk about the other stuff if you're interested. So this is how it look, and like the best case scenario. So this doesn't look at all to your regular pasture. Like when you think about cattle in the Amazon, you won't think of that. You will think of that kind of plain and just one cow maybe. But it's a range. So you can see systems that range a lot. The species of grass that grows is different from the grass that you will see in other places in the Amazon, but it's sort of like a very interesting and unique system. So, and again, part of the work that we were trying to do was sort of frame around this idea of sustainable intensification and the ability to have landscapes that provide both diversity. It's like the ideal situation, those win-win situations. And we think, and a lot of people have been working on creating those sort of landscapes where sharing the use will provide sort of sustainable ways to use landscapes. So this is what we did. We did a lot of field work in these pastures from, the high variability. This is again in the Macas area, Piedmont area in Ecuador, with the social data, ecological data. So you see the story there. Again, putting the pieces together: ecology, social, spatial. And we did a model, and basically what we try is to look at what are the factors that tell us about the variability of trees. So we knew the variability of trees with the plot data, and then we look at the social variables and some obviously things that are biophysical constraints. And what we found is that the variability, what we found is the following. Oh, I don't have it here. But what it is basically is that you have large households, usually that are non-indigenous, to have a lot of trees, which is the opposite of what you would think. She's like, okay, if there's a lot of people, they will probably need more cows. So what it is like, it's sort of counterintuitive, but what it's saying something about how, and there's theories that show how families, like your families, can actually find value on the ecological benefits of their land and the benefits that these trees will have in there. So that's where we sort of kind of connected. But what I wanted to talk to you about was the ecosystem service piece. So how much carbon these kinds of landscapes are actually able to store, and how that compares to secondary forest or primary forest. So the answer will be less or more, probably less. And so how less it is, and so if that's of importance. So this is basically a way that I analyze remotely sensed data. This is high resolution remotely sensed data. This is 1 to 4 meters. Satellite data, multispectral, so you have not only your visible part of the spectrum, but also infrareds and things that are more away from that is obvious to our eye. And basically it's a system that creates, instead of doing classes based on the spectral variability, it takes into account sort of the spatial continuity, so it's textural. So things that are similar are one thing, even if the spectral signature is similar in another place, but they will be separated just because they are separate from each other. So this generates a map that looks like this with a lot of polygons. So when you think about a landscape there, this is the high resolution, this is your trees, these are your pastures, and these are trees within the pasture. This system allows you to sort of understand the actual canopy cover. So if I go into technical, I love these things. So what I was able to do is basically connect that segmentation analysis to the plot data. That is basically the measurements of like basal area, biomass. And then I use this correlation to look at what happens regionally, which I think is very sort of obvious. Regularly, for these systems, when you use remotely sensed data, you use something that is called NDVIs, or normalized vegetation indices, which is just vegetation figure. It's very quickly to estimate. But what I found is that that index has very little help us very little in terms of understanding that plot data. However, I found a much stronger relationship with the segmentation that I just showed you. And so I could use this simple linear model to understand how much biomass gets to be accumulated in these different areas. And what we show is like we have around, it varies a lot, but it's between 60 megatons per hectare to maybe 7 or 8, which is low. But if you think about secondary growth forests, and I hope I have that table. Sorry, I'm going to just go because I have it. Sorry, I don't have it. But I can show you, the primary forest goes above 150. So it's obviously, this is half of it, but it still is significant. So I'm thinking that silvopastoral systems are okay. So that's because you think about these kinds of systems as something that is not. So that's that. And Colombia, that's an exciting thing. I'm from Colombia, so that's why I'm excited. So this is what I've been working recently, and this is a paper that we just got published in Nature, that's in January, and is looking at the effects of conflict in protected areas. And so this is a map that was published in Science, I think it was a year ago, that was showing basically, the article was sort of like, talking about how many of these places that were kind of sort of protected because of the violence, all of a sudden were like really being opened up. And we're not only open up to science, which was very good, but also open up to different kinds of uses or abuses. And they were basically sort of trying to kind of provide a warning. Like, okay, if this is going to happen, so probably you're familiar with the peace treaty in Colombia, happened in 2016. And so basically the main revolutionary guerrilla group, the FARC, decided to give up their arms. And this is the areas where they were really strongholds from them. This is in 2013 and 2002. So you can see the large extents of the territory actually being sort of like in some way controlled by that. So which kept a lot of people away from it in some way or another because of the conflict. And what we see is that obviously those areas shrink, and basically part of the goal is that this will disappear completely, which will make them sort of safe. And so that's sort of the assumption. So my colleague Dolores Armenteras out of Universidad Nacional that is working on fires, and I look at is like, okay, so let's see what's going on in terms of fires in these protected areas before and after the conflict. And can we see that as a signal of what can occur in terms of deforestation in protected areas? And again, these are sort of more like these unintended consequences of something that is as important as signing the peace treaty. Okay? It's like, okay, so what is going to unfold after that? So what you see here is a map looking at deforestation. This is from the IDEAM. This is the Institute. That will be like the USGS for us. Looking at deforestation in protected areas and buffer areas. And you can see that some have been like dramatically affected, the red ones specifically. So what we see is that there is already a thinking that deforestation is happening, but again, this is land cover maps that are not very reliable, this and that. So we say, okay, can we use fire as a proxy? And this is what we did. So we use fire data from MODIS. These are active fire data. This is where my colleague works on. And we look basically at fires in 2017 and 2018 inside and outside protected areas. And so you can see just from the yellow and the red. So the yellow is in 2007, and in 2018 that there is really sort of more red than yellow in a way. That's the first thing. But the second thing is how inside protected areas, there is really a huge jump. And so for us, this paper allows to just sort of provide a warning. This is really important to see. So obviously, fires are not necessarily translated into deforestation. But my colleague, again, Dolores, has been able to model fires and correlate that with deforestation, and she finds that there is quite linear. So what we expect is that it's going to be really we assume that at least 52% increase in deforestation inside protected areas just to looking at these fire data. And so this is sort of the maps and the models that we were able to sort of construct in these protected areas around fires and deforestation. And so part of the things when we were publishing the paper is that we were able to compare 2017 deforestation rates with what we found in the model, but for 2018 was a little more difficult. But then reality happens. And so we don't need maps anymore. This is all over the news. Fires everywhere, deforestation everywhere. So I don't know how many, I saw a Colombian mochila over there, so, and Sergio's here. So I saw some Colombians here. So you know that this is, so basically what you see is many of these protected areas just being affected. And part of the story that we said that, and obviously there's a lot of, and here's where things get tricky, is why is this occurring? And so we see this institutional vacuum really happening in a lot of these areas that were really controlled by these armed groups. And some of those actually, in some way, were sort of protecting some of these areas. And basically when they are not there enforcing anything, there is a need for, okay, how do I get back even access to that land or claims to that land? And I think this is where we're sort of seeing here, that institutional vacuum being filled by these different kinds of actors in trying to get hold back to that land. But I mean, in terms of the places that are being affected, it could be quite dramatic. So that's sort of the story with that. And so what we're now trying to move on, or I'm trying to sort of look at, is not only protected areas, but is what is really going on like the Orinoco part of the Colombian, which is an area similar to the Cerrado in Brazil, that is really being opened up for development. So what is going to happen if infrastructure change, how that's going to alter sort of those ecosystems that were sort of protected before. And so what kinds of idea of landscapes will sort of happen. And so it's mostly modeling, but I think it's of interest just to see how this is going to unfold. So more to come, is I guess what I want to say. Okay, so this is all I have to say. Again, there's many more things that I will be happy to discuss, and I'm happy to answer any questions. I hope I didn't go over too long. And thank you very much for your attention.